Welcome to Talk the Walk. I'm Sarah Wong. China surprised economists last week with impressive trade figures. Its global trade surplus surged to $676 billion in 2021, despite strict lockdown measures targeting sporadic coronavirus outbreaks. And its trade surplus with the United States rose 25% to $396 billion, despite frictions between the world's two largest economies. Little headway has been made since U.S. President Joe Biden took office a year ago, and neither side has announced a date to resume face-to-face negotiations. Joining us today to unpack Sino-U.S. economic ties in the new year is Brian Klein. He's a former U.S. diplomat and trade official. Welcome back to Talk the Walk, Brian. Good to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me back again.
Now, what's your read of the latest trade figures from Beijing and the trade surplus that China had with the United States, despite ongoing Sino-U.S. rivalry?
I think it goes to show that the relations between the U.S. and China, and actually China and the rest of the world, are still fairly strong when it comes to economic issues and trade. I mean, there's certain trade advantages to what China produces. It's not easy to replicate, and there's enough consumer demand to keep the surplus going. So it's somewhat promising that despite all the politics, the economics and the trade continues despite a lot of the frictions that we're seeing.
Here's something that I found puzzling. Why does global demand for Chinese goods remain robust throughout the course of 2021, despite draconian COVID measures curtail manufacturing in China?
Well, it's curious. I think a lot of it was the early ordering, at least in the U.S., for the holiday season. People knew there was going to be supply chain problems. They knew that factories in China were going to have potentially problems meeting quotas, and there might be some problems at the ports, which actually seems to be getting worse than they were a few months ago. So there were a lot of orders being put in last summer through kind of September, October, in anticipation of a lot of these problems. And in the end, there weren't empty shelves on stores for Christmas this year in the United States. So that really showed that the Chinese factories could still produce, and even at higher levels than they were ordinarily producing at. And U.S. consumer demand was very strong, partly because no one was really going out and doing anything because of COVID. So household incomes are actually going up. People are quitting jobs because they don't like them, and they have enough money to survive without having a steady income. So the demand side was really strong. And also on the supply side, factors really kicked into higher gear in early anticipation of the problems.
Do you see China continuing to enjoy the trade headwinds in the new year, given where we are in the pandemic and where we're heading towards?
I think it's going to slow down a bit, quite frankly, because the dynamics in the United States are starting to change a bit. Inflation is very high, and it's sticking around much longer than anybody expected. Certainly the Fed was, selling the idea last year that it was transitory, and now they don't use the word transitory anymore because it's not transitory. It's higher, in fact, than it was in the recent past, and much higher than expected. The last quarter was much higher than expected. So I think on the consumer demand side, things might be starting to slow down. I mean, the power of the dollar is just being eroded by inflation quite rapidly. Until that's under control, I don't see how household spending is going to stay high like it did towards the end of last year. On the China side, consumer demand is also waning. I mean, the last quarter GDP growth numbers were very low. There was a spike, maybe 5-6 months ago, up into the 8 to 10% range, and then dropped dramatically now at around 4% or so, depending on which statistics you look at. But it looks like consumer demand in China is also taking a hit, and that has to be from people not going out and living their lives as much, although they're out a lot more than they are in the U.S. But there's going to be a hit, and there's usually a lag, usually a 1 to 2 quarter lag to see it in the numbers. But I expect that by the mid-year, you'll start seeing the downtrend.
Yeah, I see. A lot of economists and analysts agree with you. They predict that as we proceed to the new year in 2022, a lot of countries, especially in Southeast Asia, they emerged from the COVID lockdown and proceed to living with the virus, and then that will result in a lot of manufacturing activities relocating to the emerging market in Southeast Asia, and thus that may reduce the economic growth and manufacturing trade headwinds that China has been enjoying in 2021. Now let's talk about the decoupling between U.S. and China economy further. It seems like the decoupling activity is harder than said than done, but China is falling short of its purchase promises stated in a phase one trade deal with the Trump administration. Now, trade data through November show that its imports from the U.S., including manufactured, agricultural, and energy goods, amounted to less than 60% of the additional $200 billion that the agreement targeted over 2 years. Why do you think that is? And was the pandemic mainly to blame, or are there any structural factors that are holding China back?
Well, I think part of it is political. I think that that trade deal negotiated under former President Trump put on certain high expectations for sales that were going to be very difficult to meet. So the part of it, it's a complicated issue, but part of it is from that. Some of those purchases were never going to hit the results that were expected. Part of it, I think, is political in the sense that China doesn't feel any strong obligation to honor that agreement. I mean, to some degree, they'll say, yes, sure, we signed it, we're going to do it, but it's a new president. So it's up for renegotiation and relations can change. And so there's a political dimension of, well, do we really need to hit these targets even when we can hit the targets? And I think part of it is just structural in this, like you mentioned, in the sense that there are real impediments to getting goods to market, getting goods. I mean, there are all kinds of supply chain bottlenecks both ways. So that's also part of the picture. Now, when the arguments start happening at the political level, it tends to get twisted a bit on both sides of, what's really the cause. I think at least those three components are all at play. And, the trade deal's it's done. I mean, that phase of it is done. Whether something else gets renegotiated, I'm fairly skeptical that there will be anything renegotiated in the short term. But it's not totally unexpected that the targets weren't met.
Yeah, well, the Biden administration seemed to be keen to hold on to the trade agreement, the trade let's say, the trade mechanism that the Trump administration put in place. For example, U.S. President Joe Biden, marking his first year in office, said he's not ready to lift the tariffs that Trump imposed on Chinese imports. Now, how do you see the trade tensions between the world's two largest economies play out during the rest of the Biden's presidency, especially after this year's midterm election, when Republican lawmakers are expected to gain power in Congress?
Right. Well, I think 2022 is going to be a pivotal year for U.S.-China economic relations. And they're probably going to get worse before they get better, and I'm not sure they are going to get better. So this might be the new baseline for where things are at. And it was very instructive that when Biden came into office, he didn't seek to kind of put his own mark on the relationship. He, like you said, he carried over this Trump era tariffs, and there was no political reason to lower them. I mean, the same voter base that's being negatively impacted by competition from China, and much of it in certain industries, like in steel, where there's state backing on the China side, and then you have American companies that have to be competitive against state backing. It's very difficult. So those voters are, a valuable voter base for both Democrats and this kind of neoconservative Republican movement under Trump. So there was no reason for him to really change things. There are some more tensions on the way. I mean, there's going to be the passage of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which is expected to pass and go into force by mid-year. U.S. companies are going to have to scour their supply chains and make sure nothing is coming from Xinjiang. There's bipartisan support for that. And there isn't a lot of bipartisanship in Washington these days. So when you see something like that, and both sides agree that they want that to happen, you know that there's not going to be any kind of easing of tensions. The midterms are a tough call. I mean, usually a president from one party tends to lose in the midterms. Their party tends to lose in the midterms. It's kind of a historical artifact of the system here. Will that happen again? Don't know. Pundits say yes. Polling suggests yes, but polling is really early on this. Biden's approval ratings are particularly low for a first-term president. They're well below 50%. People here are frustrated. It's in the news every day now. What has Biden really accomplished? He went on live television today to speak to the press, to kind of sell his successes, of which there are many. I mean, the country's in a different place now than we were a year ago when it came to COVID, and even in large part the economy. So it remains to be seen whether or not the midterms will actually yield a Republican-controlled House and Senate. If it does, that still speaks to a hard line on China from the U.S. side. So I think it's going to be a pivotal year, and I think it's going to be a difficult year because there's no pressure really to change the way things are right now. And actually there is a little bit of pressure, and that pressure is growing to tighten up things, tighten up policies, make things more difficult. And that, I think, is going to continue.
All right, let's talk more about the difficult and pivotal year after the break. Todd the Walk will be back in a moment. Stay with us.